you will see a notification on the top says you are recording. Okay, so again, thank you everyone who managed to join the meeting. Thank you for your time. I know it's Saturday and everyone is always busy this day, either family time, and I'd like to start by thanking Professor Jacob Mundy for joining this webinar. A lot of people out there, they are aware of the conflict. They are aware of the role that Spain, France play in the conflict. There is very little known about the part that the U.S. plays, which is a very crucial role in deciding the fate of Western Sahara. So today we are joined with Professor Jacob Mundy to speak about the U.S. foreign policy on Western Sahara and the history of the U.S. involvement in general. So I will open the floor to Professor Jacob Mundy to go over anything that is possibly related to the foreign policy. And for the audience, please, if you have any questions, type them on the meeting chat, and then we will try to ask those questions accordingly. Please try to avoid repeating the same questions. You can read the chat from the right side of your screen. Professor Jacob, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk about U.S. foreign policy in Western Sahara. I think the United States is probably one of the most important actors when it comes to this issue. As you stated at the outset, we understand Spain because of the colonial legacy and the continuing ties, and we understand the role of France as being one of the most obstructionist powers, particularly given its support for Morocco. But the United States has a long history of being involved in this conflict. The United States played a decisive role in 1975 when Morocco began its invasion of Western Sahara. The United States worked on the UN Security Council to make sure that Morocco was not opposed in its aggression in Western Sahara. The United States knew that Morocco was going to invade Western Sahara several weeks before the Green March was even announced. There's even belief among former U.S. officials that the United States received advanced plans for the Green March, possibly as much as a year ahead of time. As we know that once Spain announced that it was going to hold a referendum in 1974, Morocco began developing plans to take the territory by force if needed. And so the United States played a pivotal role in that fateful autumn of 1975, where both East Timor and Western Sahara were invaded by more powerful neighbors. The United States policy is officially neutral, which is to say the United States will accept, or says that it will accept, either an independent Western Sahara or some form of unification with Morocco. Now that's the official de jure policy. The de facto policy has been largely pro-Moroccan in nature, which is to say that the United States is willing to accept any solution as long as Morocco accepts it as well. It's very difficult to imagine the United States going against Moroccan interests on this issue. And there are many reasons for the close relations between Morocco and the United States. They go back, before the Cold War, but during the Cold War, Morocco was a key ally of the United States. Morocco ended up receiving more military and development aid than any other African country from the United States during the Cold War, second only to Egypt. And we understand that Egypt has a very special relationship with the United States as well. So throughout the Cold War, Morocco was a very close ally of the United States, supporting American interests as well as French interests and things of that sort. Morocco has also been closely united with, you could say, the more conservative side of the Arab world, particularly the Gulf monarchies and Saudi Arabia above all. Indeed, Saudi Arabia helped support Morocco's war in Western Sahara with significant financial aid that allowed Morocco to purchase U.S., French, and other kinds of weapons during the war for Western Sahara. So at one point, it was $1 billion a year that Morocco was receiving in not inflation-adjusted dollars. So it's quite a sum if we think about it today. Morocco has continued to be supported by the United States even into the referendum period from 1992 onward. Again, the United States is officially neutral when it comes to the final status of Western Sahara, but we also know that the United States has in many ways pushed the Western Sahara peace process towards what we might call a power sharing type deal, or Moroccans prefer as autonomy. And so even though high-profile former U.S. officials like James Baker were involved in the Western Sahara peace process, it's turned out that the United States views a stable Morocco as much more important than anything that might lead to Moroccan instability. And so this is one of the reasons why the referendum was killed, to put it bluntly. The United States helped kill the referendum in 1999 after King Hassan II passed away. We've seen some changes, variations in U.S. policy. We saw sort of a very pro-Moroccan drift in the previous Bush administration that was largely due to Elliott Abrams on the UN Security Council. We've seen Moroccan lobbying in Washington, D.C. trying to push American policy, particularly through the Congress, towards a more pro-Moroccan policy. And recently we saw a very strange but short-lived tilt towards maybe a more pro-Polisario policy under John Bolton. But for the most part, I would say the basic issue for the United States is that the Western Sahara issue, as is the status quo, is quite acceptable because of the relative stability it brings to a region that has become actually very unstable in recent years. We have the problem of terrorism in the Sahel, which the Sahrawis have experienced directly, including the kidnapping of foreign aid workers from the camps. But then we also have the wars that have developed since 2011 and the Arab Spring in Libya, in Syria, and elsewhere. So when U.S. policymakers look at Morocco, they see a country that's quite stable, one that is economically moving in what they believe to be the right direction, and they're not keen to put a lot of pressure on Morocco. And it's very clear that even the smallest amounts of pressure are often met with very fierce resistance for Morocco. If you just take the question of MINURSO and human rights monitoring, the suggestion that the Obama administration would attempt to impose a human rights monitoring mandate on MINURSO triggered what the Moroccans classified as one of the greatest diplomatic crises between Washington and Rabat, which is I mean, it's not that big of a deal because MINURSO already, in a way, monitors human rights if you just read the reports of the Secretary General. But Morocco is very much resistant to any kind of pressure and is protected to a large extent by France. So I would say, yeah, that's the broad outline of U.S. policy. We can go into details as people like.
Thank you. I wanted to remind everyone who just joined, if you have any questions, please ask those questions in the chat, and we will ask them accordingly. One of the questions I personally have is mostly surrounding the autonomy proposal. Many of us are aware of the autonomy proposal. Many of us know that it has at some point was the only solution that many people saw from the U.S., for example, administration. Most of them kind of saw and approved or supported the Moroccan proposal as a credible proposal. Can you just elaborate on the Baker plans as well as the proposal that which Morocco brought to the table, and why wasn't feasible, and what are the options on the table, currently on the table?
Yeah, well, again, going back to 1975, the UN, after 1976, after the refugees had been created and Polisario had declared the republic and all of these things, and Morocco and Mauritania agreed to divide the territory, the UN said Western Sahara is still a colony. Western Sahara is a non-self-governing territory, and whatever Morocco and Mauritania say, it doesn't matter. And so, in a sense, the Western Sahara has remained on the list of non-self-governing territories for that very reason, because the population still has yet to have the ability to exercise a popular vote on what final status should be. Morocco was pushed to organize a referendum, which it finally agreed to under the auspices of the Organization of African Unity in 1981, but it was very clear that Morocco was sort of playing a political game in the Organization of African Unity, trying to prevent Polisario from being recognized as a member state. And as we all know, once the OAU recognized Western Sahara, Morocco left the organization and didn't return until a few years ago. Nonetheless, Morocco had committed to a referendum. Now, the question then was, what kind of referendum would it be? Now, under international law, a referendum that doesn't include an independence option does not fit most understandings of what constitutes self-determination. So Morocco has, throughout the decades, said a confirmatory referendum, or things that would suggest that it wouldn't be really a free exercise of the popular will, that it would just be something that would ratify Moroccan annexation. Now, when the UN arrived in the 1990s to organize a referendum, this was based upon Morocco's commitment to referendum. But as we know at the time, Morocco thought that it could engineer the populations in Western Sahara to get the right kind of votes. So under Interior Minister Driss Basri, there was this effort to flood the referendum with Moroccans who were pretending to be Western Saharans in the votes. And so in 1999, the UN was faced with this dilemma that they had arrived at an electorate for a referendum. It was very close to what the Spanish had discovered in 1974. And the majority of Morocco's candidates had been rejected, right? So this Moroccan effort to engineer an outcome in the referendum had been defeated. So several things happened. Two, which I think are very important, is King Hassan II dies, and with him dies Morocco's interest in holding a referendum because of the changes that were conducted by Mohammed VI. The other thing that happens is in East Timor in 1999, there's also a referendum on independence, and the Indonesians didn't think that they would actually lose the referendum, but they did, and the Indonesian military then went on a killing spree, and the United Nations had to intervene. So in the UN, there was a desire to prevent an East Timor scenario in Western Sahara. So then this idea of autonomy emerges, and this would be an arrangement whereby Western Sahara would have control over its local government, maybe some of its security forces, economy, so on and so forth. Everything, to be negotiated, right? And this is what Morocco says it wants, and Morocco was pushed to a certain extent in that direction. Indeed, some of the people involved in the referendum in the 1990s never believed that Morocco would actually go through with the referendum, because they understood that once Morocco realized they couldn't engineer a fake referendum, then Morocco would have to either lose the referendum or talk about something else. And so they began talking about something else in 2000, 2001. James Baker, the former U.S. Secretary of State, who was the lead negotiator for the UN, he developed two plans. And one of the reasons he came out with the first plan, called the Draft Framework Agreement, is because Morocco wouldn't say what kind of autonomy it wanted. Indeed, this was some of the problem with the peace process until 2007, and even after, is that when Morocco says autonomy, it's very vague. And something that needs to be noted is that in international law, a regime of autonomy means that the local government cannot be abolished by the central government. So this would be a significant infringement of the powers of the monarchy or the central Moroccan government more broadly if it were to actually create an autonomous regime in Western Sahara. So Morocco, the proposals that Morocco eventually put forward in 2007 don't actually even meet the international criteria of autonomy insofar as they're vague about the limits on the central state power. Not the powers that are granted that would be granted to Western Sahara, but the powers that would constrain the monarchy. And those are the details that need to be fleshed out if there's actually to be a serious and credible autonomy, which we don't have on the table as of yet. Baker, in his final proposal, what's become known as the Baker Plan of 2003, proposed that Western Sahara could exist under a 5-year period of autonomy. The autonomy was modeled after proposals that had come out of the peace process in Aceh in Indonesia, and also the peace agreement in Sudan, where the idea was that there would be a period where we would test the autonomy and see if Sahrawis liked autonomy and see if the Moroccan government could control itself. And then there would be a referendum. And this referendum would include the options at least of continue the autonomy, integrate with Morocco, or independence. And because it included the independence option, which was mandated by the Security Council, Baker was told by the Security Council that there needs to be an independence option. Baker had to include it. But Morocco rejected this. It was supported by France, and coincidentally enough, there was one of the most significant terror attacks in Morocco in 2003, the Casablanca bombings, which had the effect of raising lots of concerns about the stability of the Moroccan monarchy and whether or not the Baker Plan was really viable at that moment. So once Morocco decided it would no longer work with James Baker, he resigns in 2004, and then the burden is now upon Morocco to develop an autonomy plan, which finally emerges in 2007. But as I've said, it's not really it's not a legally it doesn't meet the legal standards of autonomy. So it has yet to be developed. Polisario put forward a plan as well in 2007, which was in effect a set of guarantees that would continue the relationship between Morocco and Western Sahara if Western Sahara was to gain its independence. So these were, in a sense, a kind of set of post-conflict assurances that there would be, economic ties, that the Moroccan settlers could continue to own businesses and property, or stay or become citizens of Western Sahara, in fact. And really, those are the two plans that have been on the table. And Polisario, to a certain extent, still thinks the Baker Plan is the 2003 Baker Plan is the best plan. So since 2009, there was a new UN envoy, Christopher Ross, who was eventually rejected by Morocco because Ross would not impose Morocco's autonomy plan as the negotiation framework. And this has been sort of the problem with the peace process for the past 10 years, is that Morocco says we will only negotiate our autonomy. Nothing else will be negotiated. And Polisario says, well, we have a right to self-determination, and UN Security Council's resolutions say this every year. Western Sahara, has a right to self-determination. That the current framework of the peace process for over a decade has been a mutually agreed political solution that provides for self-determination, right? So something has to be negotiated, and then there has to be a referendum on it, right? But there hasn't been any substantive negotiations really since, I would say, 1997.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry. So another question that came to play is basically the role of the U.S. lobbies. The question asks, can you tell us about the lobbying mechanism in the U.S. On Western Sahara? We know that Morocco spends millions of dollars annually on various lobbyist firms to influence the Congress, to influence any decision makers in the U.S. There are many congressmen who actively, publicly spoke on supporting the Moroccan kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, with the I would say there are different groups that you could say are part of the Moroccan lobby. There's the groups that are explicitly Moroccan lobbyists. The one that's most well known is the Moroccan American Center for Policy, which is led by former U.S. Diplomats, and they were brought in around the time when Mohammed VI came to power to try to help push this autonomy idea. Morocco also hires lobbying firms. You can go through government records and see which firms are getting how much money from Morocco. But there's also different interest groups. For example, one that is probably not surprising is anti-communist Cuban Americans, who, because of Polisario's good relations with Cuba, have been very much in support of Morocco on the question of Western Sahara. So you can look around and see different lobbying groups. But in many ways, Morocco doesn't need lobbyists necessarily to make its arguments. There was a really telling example once where the King of Morocco held a reception, and he invited the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. So the bringing the Secretary of Defense was a signal of the strong relationship between the Moroccan military and the U.S. military. So in ways there's lobbying, but there's also different kinds of ways in which Morocco influences U.S. policy. For example, you might all remember when Morocco was very upset about the human rights issue in the UN, and so they canceled training exercises with the U.S. Marines, right? So there's various ways that Morocco puts pressure and builds support for its case on Western Sahara. I see in one of the questions, there's now this idea that will the U.S. open a consulate in Western Sahara? I tend to think that the lobbying hasn't gone that far, though we did see the news reporting that Israel was the one who was pushing, right, for this consulate in Western Sahara. Now, this would be if the U.S. did this, it would be the deviation from U.S. policy. So, for example, in around 2005, 2006, 2007, the Bush administration looked into whether or not they could just recognize Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, and the U.S. State Department Legal Affairs said, no, we can't do that. That would just be such a gross violation of international law. When the U.S. had a free trade agreement with Morocco, goods from Western Sahara were specifically excluded. So again, we see that the legal arguments still carry water. But going back to the question of Israel, again, here we have a very important issue that Morocco has been very supportive on U.S. policy towards the Palestinians for many decades, and has played an important role as a mediator or intermediary between Palestinians, various Arab groups, and Israelis, given the large Moroccan Jewish population that now resides in Israel. So Morocco has used those connections and that influence to also try to build up support for it in Washington, right? So there's a lot of dimensions to Moroccan lobbying, formally and informally.
Yes, and that was actually answered the next question. The question that was in regards to the Israeli reported to have lobbied the U.S. in exchange of normalized ties with Israel. We all know that has been established way back. It's not something new that the Kingdom of Morocco have normalized relations with Israel. Then the next question is in regards to the referendum. You've earlier mentioned that some believe or see that the referendum option was killed or is no longer exists. So the question starting with the word the referendum is killed. A lot of Sahrawis right now don't believe in the peaceful process. Instead, they do prefer or much want to return to war. The question is, what is your opinion about the actual demands of some Sahrawi activists about return to war, and how does the U.S. sees that?
Yeah, well, I imagine that a lot of Sahrawis are very frustrated with the peace process. As I've mentioned, there really hasn't been negotiations in any meaningful sense since the Houston Accords in 1997, right? So, and in next year, MNURSO will now be 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades old, right? That's not a good sign that the UN mission will be entering its 30th year. So returning to war would be a very serious issue, and the United States would very much strongly try to prevent that from happening. So if you take the example of the Paris-Dakar rally crisis that happened in 2001, where Polisario mobilized its forces, the United States intervened diplomatically, very discreetly, to try to prevent that from happening, and putting a lot of pressure on Algeria to prevent it from happening. So the question of going to war also obviously does involve Algeria, because Algeria, to a certain extent, even if Algeria couldn't support the war, a new war in Western Sahara, couldn't support Polisario with arms and things of that sort, obviously it would have to be consulted, because it would be, the war would be on Algerian soil to a certain extent. And so the big question there would be, is Algeria willing to risk its relations? It doesn't have great relations with Morocco. Relations with France are always complicated, and relations with the United States tend to be more on the level of terrorism and oil, right? The two things that the United States cares about the most. So the United States would, as I suggest, would probably try to prevent a new war, but I would think that the United States shouldn't be surprised if there was a war, given the fact that all other options seem to have been stopped, largely as a result of U.S. policy. The United States not pushing hard enough for a solution to the Western Sahara issue, right? So I know that anger and frustration among Sahrawis is very real, and I think many of us understand. And to a certain extent, if we look at various events like the Paris-Dakar rally crisis in 2001, the Sahrawi Intifada of 2005, the Gdaimi Zik, these kinds of things do result in people taking more interest in Western Sahara. It would be very sad if it took a war to get people to take the Western Sahara issue seriously, but sometimes it seems reasonable to think that war is the only thing that will get anyone's attention.
And sadly, that's the case. I know a number of the youth in particular that share the same sentiment, that it takes war, you don't really have any other options. We've sat here, we waited, we've pled our case in front or before the international community, but to this day, decades after, no one have came forward to support it. Not even those who actively and publicly disagreed with the France, for example, involvement, the U.S. involvement in the conflict. And in regards to that, there is a question: why would the rest of the world leave in the hands of the U.S., France, and Spain the conflict of Western Sahara? Where are their responsibility? And basically, a question around the role of other nations around on Security General, the General Assembly. What's the role of other nations in this conflict, apart from the U.S., France, and Spain.
Yeah, one of the things I think is causing not just the Western Sahara conflict, right, but the fact that the peace process has done nothing, and nothing is done to change it, is the structure of the United Nations, the Security Council, and the role of the Permanent Five members. Of the Permanent Five members, you have the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, who are part of the Friends of Western Sahara group in the UN. This group was formed in the 1990s. It includes Spain, and strangely, Russia was added as well. The Russia has not historically been viewed as a central player in the conflict, but during that period, when they formed the group of Friends for Western Sahara, they thought it would be best to keep Russia on the inside of the process. Now, in the UN, the United States is more often than not the country that is actually writing the resolutions. Because of it views itself as neutral on the question, or at least more neutral than France, but also having more power than the other players. Now, the Security Council, which is where the decisions are ultimately made, is one that, depending on who's where, who's elected to the council, who's not, can be more or less favorable to Western Sahara. Though at the center of it, you have France, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia, who are really the only powers that can do anything in terms of changing MINURSO's mandates, even vetoing MINURSO, right? I mean, this was sort of what we suspected John Bolton was threatening, and that's what was maybe going to get the peace process going again before Morocco more or less seemed to have rejected Hurst Kohler. But the idea being that the only pressure that you can be really put on the parties at the level of the Security Council at this point is vetoing the UN mission, which any of the Permanent Five members could do. The United States could do it in, I believe it's October, when the next time it will be discussed. And that would send a very strong signal that MINURSO has failed. But there's also a lot of fear that without the peacekeepers in Western Sahara, you will be guaranteed to have a more unstable situation, right? So, but again, I think you have to look at the Security Council and the fact that, what UN people call the big boys, France, the United States, that when their interests are involved, it actually tends to mean that nothing is going to happen. The General Assembly, of course, can pass resolutions, and through its bodies, like the Fourth Committee, can hold hearings and look into it. Western Sahara, the human rights organizations, bodies, special rapporteurs, all of that stuff is good for generating knowledge and information, and for more often than not with the General Assembly reaffirming Western Sahara's status as a non-self-governing territory that too should have a referendum on self-determination. But really, where the rubber meets the road geopolitically in Western Sahara is the Security Council.
Thank you. Another question here says, how did the Algerian-U.S. relation influence the conflict, especially with their history with communism? Also, did the Polisario ever try to approach the U.S. officially or unofficially?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Algeria, as Sahrawis know better than any other people, Algeria has been a very independent voice in the international community. It's tried to be a strong voice for the non-aligned movements during the Cold War, and even after. Algeria in the 1970s even tried to really try to create an independent sort of economic system for the third world, for the developing world, and that in conjunction with other countries that would use their oil wealth to help develop the third world. Algeria also wasn't necessarily a communist country, but was very much more on the socialist side of things, and also was a supporter of black radical groups in the United States, the IRA, the Canary Islands independence movement, things of that sort, right? So Algeria was always sort of really trying to balance its leadership role in the developing world, the non-aligned world, with the desire to actually have decent working relations with the United States. So if you take the example of Libya, where Gaddafi, was openly confrontational with the United States to a very high degree, Algeria was much more trying to play a balancing act, and some of this has to do with the fact that American oil companies were some of the first to go into Algeria after independence, so there's strong connections there. It is surprising to many historians that Algeria was never labeled a sponsor of terrorism, even though some of the groups that the West called terrorists did operate in Algeria, received training, or were given safe haven there. But again, it's because Algeria has always tried to be more or less neutral. Now, Algeria, unfortunately, in the 1990s, there was a major conflict in the country, which saw it not have as much of a leadership role on the international stage. But in the 2000s, under Bouteflika, Algeria started to reach out to the United States in a very strong way, and there were growing relations, especially on the issue of terrorism. Now, Bouteflika and Bush actually had a kind of falling out of relationships because of the Baker Plan, which is to say that the United States wanted Algeria to push Polisario to accept the 2003 Baker Plan. Algeria did that. But when it came time for the United States to push Morocco to accept the Baker Plan, the United States didn't do that. And you'll notice from 2004 onwards, Bouteflika is elected by what appears to be a very honest majority, a real democratic election, unlike the one in 1999. And so Bouteflika starts diverging from U.S. interests in some way over the issue of Western Sahara. The United States and Algeria have never really kind of come back together in the way that they did after 9/11. Algeria has been wary to a certain extent of the United States. And since 2011, Algeria has reason to be kind of nervous with Libya falling apart, Mali falling apart. You have these interventions happening all around them. And the United States is either involved in these interventions, allowing them to happen, or more recently is being indifferent to them in some ways, right? So Algeria is in a very strange situation, not the least of which because of the recent revolution there, if you want to call it that, right, the Hirak movement. Now, Polisario's relationships with the U.S., the Polisarios actually had representation, not officially recognized, but has had representation in Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know if Polisario ever asked the United States to recognize Western Sahara, but it's possible. But since the 1980s, there has been a Polisario representative and has met with State Department officials in addition to members of Congress on a regular occasion, and even to a certain extent developing their own network of lobbyists.
Thank you. The next question we have is what are the options to the Sahara we have vis-a-vis the status quo to shake things up, other than war? Of course, war is definitely an option to shake things up.
To shake things up. Well, let's look at the challenges. You could Polisario could boycott the peace process, but that doesn't mean anything because Morocco refuses to engage in dialogue anyway. Until Polisario says, okay, no referendum, we accept autonomy, Morocco is not going to negotiate, right? And at what point would there be anything to negotiate? So diplomatically, there's not many options in terms of the peace process. It's become more difficult to find other governments that will recognize Western Sahara, although the recognition by the African Union is very important and gives important standing under international law. We have not seen major recognitions coming, and we've seen some reversals and other sorts of strange, legally dubious, efforts to de-recognize Western Sahara, which you actually can't do under international law, but it doesn't matter because it's politics. Sahrawi civil society in the occupied territory faces extreme challenges when it comes to organizing. Since Gdaimi Zik, the space for free expression, not to mention demonstrations, organizing, has become incredibly limited. The Moroccan police security presence, intelligence presence is very thick, and it makes organizing very difficult, even though in the last 2 decades, the amount of information we get out of Western Sahara, thanks to activists who, record events and are able to speak more freely, we know more about what happens in Western Sahara. But the problem is that the Moroccans have really just clamped down on civil society in the territory and made it very difficult to organize, to protest, to do the kinds of things that got international attention in 2005 and then 2010. So we see that what I've called the siege, right? The media siege is still in place with Western Sahara. Never mind the fact that international observers are often kicked out of the territory before they even arrive. And so it's become very difficult for the international community to independently assess what is going on in Western Sahara. Probably the most promising venue right now is international law when it comes to Western Sahara. We've seen some very important victories in terms of natural resource questions in the EU court system, in the African court system, and elsewhere. That when Sahrawis are able to bring international legal challenges, it tends to be very much in their favor, because in terms of international law, the question of Western Sahara is very clear. It couldn't be clearer than any other issue, right? That it's a non-self-governing territory under foreign occupation, and that makes these legal battles one of the more interesting avenues. But it's not to say that they're always successful or always will be successful, and it doesn't really give a lot of space for civil society, except that it's very important that Morocco is not allowed to say that it can represent Sahrawi interests. So, for example, if Morocco says to a foreign company, it's okay to exploit Western Sahara's resources because it will benefit the people, because here's 5 Sahrawi civil society groups that we manufactured, right? So what needs to happen in terms of civil society organizing is making it very clear that Morocco's efforts to economically colonize Western Sahara are being challenged, that they're not accepted by large parts of the indigenous population.
Thank you. I wanted to remind those who just joined, if you have any question, please add them to the chat. And also, I'll be posting shortly a survey just as we approach the end. We have a few more questions. Hopefully, we don't take more time than we needed. I will post a survey. Please, before leaving this meeting, make sure that you leave us your feedback so we make sure that we can improve on, or if you have any questions, either for the Sahrawi Association in the US or for the Professor Jacob Mundy, please leave those messages. And if you'd like for us to reach out to you next or send you the invite for our upcoming meetings or webinars, please leave us your email and we'll send you an invite. The next question we have here, so this is in regard to Friends of Western Sahara. There are people who still think that the word friends just a misleading friends. They're not friends really. The question is here, should we call for the dismantling of that group?
I mean, it would be an interesting campaign. It would expose elements of the conflict that I don't think is really well known, which is how the issue is managed in the United Nations by a small group of four states, and increasingly in some ways the United States. When Bolton was National Security Advisor, we saw that the United States wasn't even consulting with the Friends of Western Sahara, and that's when we got those extraordinary abstention votes from Russia and China. So we've seen periods where it's even really just unilaterally the United States is representing the Friends of Western Sahara. But yeah, it's very important to make sure that it's well understood that this isn't just the fact that Morocco and Polisario are opposed in terms of their policies, but that there is a group of powerful states that have basically seen the status quo as beneficial to their interests.
Thank you. The next question, whenever we discuss the possibility of the U.S. recognizing Western Sahara, they say, well, Morocco was the first country recognized in the U.S., which shows that this partnership has been there forever. What do you think about this? Is there any other possibility where the U.S. and the rest of the world being biased and support justice for our cause?
Yeah, there's this is almost a kind of mythology. these stories about the United States and Morocco being one of the oldest alliances. Some of this has to do with anti-piracy efforts that were going on. The United States wanted its ships not to be attacked in the Mediterranean, and so it would sign diplomatic letters with different powers, different the Bays and the Days and the whoever was ruling Algiers or Tunis or Tripoli, so on and so forth, right? Now, whether or not this actually, the oldest, treaty of friendship is whether it's really as significant as people say, I don't know. But the United States will probably, it's not going to recognize Western Sahara insofar as something short of a political agreement is negotiated. Now, as I said, the U.S. policy officially is neutral on the question of final status, that the United States would recognize Western Sahara were a referendum to lead to independence. But the problem is that the United States is very much aware of the fact that Morocco will do almost everything in its power to stop that from happening. And there are obviously concerns that if Morocco is somehow forced to leave Western Sahara through sanctions or other forms of international pressure, that that could destabilize Morocco. So again, one of the mythologies that seems to drive U.S. policy are these myths of Morocco being this ancient friend, but the other mythology is that Morocco is an incredibly unstable country, that one small push and it will fall apart. And this is something that Moroccans often sell to foreign leaders. As I said, in 2003, when the world was debating the Baker Plan, there was a mass terrorist attack in Morocco, and no one suspected that was coming. And so Morocco uses terrorism to try to get sympathy and say, we're helping you fight terrorism, and we are victims of terrorism, and if you don't support us, who knows what could happen in Morocco? The country, heaven forbid, there could be a revolution that creates a republic.
Okay, the next question is, why did the Republican former UN envoy James Baker resign, even if he was close to the Bush administration? And the same thing goes to Christopher Ross, who had great support from the Republican president at the time, Obama administration. And this is also a question, just in the same context, is why almost every former even the most recent, why the resignation always comes in a vague way. Like, why is it because of the pressure? What is exactly your interpretation of the resignations of any personal envoy to the territory?
Yeah, Baker is, he'd had the position for 7 years, so it had been a while to try to negotiate Western Sahara. Baker, one of the really important features of his style of negotiation was he was very direct, in that he would really just try to get to the fundamental issues and resolve them, and none of these games that get played. So we've unfortunately seen the Western Sahara peace process has degenerated since Baker left. That there's a lot of these games are played, and Morocco is not very serious, right? Morocco, one of Morocco's favorite things to do was send the interior minister to negotiations on Western Sahara to say that this is a domestic issue. Well, Baker put an end to that, right? And said, no, you have to send your foreign minister to negotiations, right? So Baker was very very straightforward and good. And Baker, a longtime Republican, a very powerful figure in the Republican Party. Baker was also on the legal team that helped get Bush Jr. elected when there was a contest over the elections in Florida in the United States in 2000, right? So Baker's ties to the Bush family are also very deep. Now, this is a very interesting question. Why did the Bush administration choose to support Morocco rather than Baker? And I'm not sure we have a full understanding at this point, because it's very interesting that soon after, right, there's this effort to have the Baker Plan imposed on the peace process. The Bush administration seems to back away from supporting Baker and starts moving towards more support for Morocco. So Morocco is designated a major non-NATO ally, and a free trade agreement is dealt, right? So that's in 2004, right? And so Baker can kind of sense that U.S. policy is not going to take any risks for peace in Western Sahara. And I mean, generally, you could say that's the history of U.S. policy. In terms of Western Sahara, is that the United States just doesn't want to take any risks that could lead to further destabilization. Of course, they never realized that the status quo is probably becoming more and more unstable in and of itself. So it was indeed very surprising that Bush didn't support Baker as much as he should have. Now, Baker resigned because Morocco stopped working with Baker. Baker had subsequent negotiations or talks with Morocco after the Security Council weekly endorsed the Baker Plan. Baker said, okay, if you don't want this, what do you want? And the Moroccans refused to participate. So Baker really couldn't do anything because the Security Council wasn't going to tell Morocco, wasn't going to put any pressure on Morocco, right? So, and this is one of the things that the peace process in Western Sahara is under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which means it can only go forward if the parties cooperate, right? And so Morocco has has a lot of power in terms of just saying, yeah, we're not going to cooperate. Although it's worth pointing out that Polisario also refused to work with Peter van Walsum, who was a Dutch diplomat that took over after, right? And the reason they did that is because Van Walsum said Polisario should give up on the referendum. It's time to be realistic. And so Polisario said we have no faith in this negotiator. Now, at that time, this was still the Bush administration. Christopher Ross was already interested in the issue, and he became the personal envoy. Now, Christopher Ross is a skilled diplomat who speaks Arabic fluently, or the Algerians would say poetically, he speaks Arabic. But the problem was, Ross obviously not as powerful of a figure as James Baker. Right, Ross also faced a problem, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of Morocco. That basically Morocco's position has been that negotiations should be about the autonomy proposal. That any effort to talk about anything else, or referendum, independence, whatever, is off the table. And so Morocco really has boycotted the peace process for over a decade. And Ross, despite his diplomatic skills and his effort to stay with the process, years after Morocco refused to meet with him. It shows his dedication, but it also shows that the personal envoys are very weak when it comes to trying to negotiate this issue. Because if the Security Council isn't willing to put pressure on the parties, especially in terms of actual pressure like sanctions, then really there's not much the personal envoy can do.
Thank you. Another question in regards to our expectation from the upcoming U.S. election. With the upcoming U.S. election, what party has been more supportive of the solution in Western Sahara throughout history? And is there any political figures in the U.S. currently in the U.S. that supports the Polisario other than John Bolton? I know John Bolton was very much involved in the conflict, not necessarily supportive of the independence, but he was very vocal in regards to the UN inaction in the territory.
Yeah. Well, the last part of the question, are there other political figures? Yeah, I mean, regularly there are efforts to get letters signed by figures in Congress. Patrick Leahy is a powerful supporter of Polisario. The former Secretary of State, John Kerry, had historically been very strong on Western Sahara, except when he was Secretary of State, he didn't do very much for Western Sahara. Susan Rice, when she was the UN representative for the United States, attempted to push through the human rights mandate unsuccessfully, but she historically has been a supporter of Western Sahara. I would say it's strange that often it's under Republican presidencies in the United States that you tend to see maybe a little bit more movement towards peace in Western Sahara. And this is sort of interesting because usually it's the liberals who, you'd think are more supportive of Polisario. Polisario actually has very strong connections to the Republican Party. The biggest supporter in the Senate right now is James Inhofe from Oklahoma, who I believe has been to the refugee camps several times, and who even brings other policymakers and congressional officials. So I wouldn't be surprised if Western Sahara more would happen under a Republican presidency. And indeed, one of the things we have to be worried about is the Democrats have often been very bad on Western Sahara. That Hillary Clinton is very well known for her support for Morocco in this respect. We didn't see a lot happen when she was Secretary of State. The Clintons, President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, both have been more biased towards Morocco in this sense. And what I strongly suspect from if Joe Biden wins the presidency in November, that we will see an administration that looks a lot like Obama and Clinton, which if you look at the 1990s and you look at the previous decade under Obama, there wasn't a lot of movements on Western Sahara. And it's even sort of interesting that Morocco had invested so much in Clinton, and she lost the election in 2016, and the Moroccans kind of had to scramble to try to figure out the Trump administration because they had bets on Hillary Clinton winning.
Mullah, your mic.
Sorry about that. So there has been a rumor that late last year, what we heard called the deal of the century, where the U.S. was about to strike a deal with the Kingdom of Morocco to support that deal. Some say that Pompeo was coming with Netanyahu to Morocco to meet the king, and that the State Department had already prepared a statement supporting the autonomy and thus aligning itself with Morocco and burying the conflict. But things did not go well that way as it was supposed to be. The question is, Morocco king backed away at the last minute, fearing that the reaction of Moroccan public opinion and the Arab street how true is this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I've seen the same reports that there was a quid pro quo idea that Morocco would offer some more recognition to Israel, maybe even recognize Jerusalem as the capital, I'm not sure, in exchange for U.S. Backing autonomy, right? And again, right? Official U.S. policy is to be neutral with respect to final status, but the United States has also been actually one of the strongest supporters of Morocco's autonomy proposal, right? It was the United States who got rid of the referendum in 1999 and 2000 and pushed for autonomy. It was the United States who pushed Morocco very hard to put out its autonomy proposal in 2007. Hillary Clinton, one of her first statements, in Marrakesh in 2010, I believe, at a conference, was to say that U.S. policy hasn't changed, and we still view it as realistic and credible, right? So a dramatic change in U.S. policy would come with the U.S. recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, which the United States doesn't, right? So if the Moroccans were able to engineer something of that sort and to tie it to Israel, that would be a very dramatic change of events in terms of the geopolitical landscape. But again, I do, we all know that Arab leaders are very bad on the question of Palestine, but we know that the Arab street is very good about the question of Palestine. So was Mohammed VI worried about, the popular backlash? Were he to recognize Israel more than they currently do? It seems very likely, but again, I wasn't traveling with Pompeo, so I have no idea.
Thank you. So we are approaching the last 2 to 3 questions. There is a question that might be a little bit repetitive, but there is a little bit about the Green March and the WikiLeaks, and there is also another question in regards to naming or calling the Morocco Kingdom as a terrorist state simply because of the realities when it comes to. So the question in regards to the WikiLeaks. Recently, there has been some talk and even documents revealed through the WikiLeaks saying that the U.S. had a major role play in the Green March through Henry Kissinger. Does that say anything about how the U.S. views the conflict, and if so, did that change at all? The second question in regards to it says, why United States and Morocco relation when it comes to terrorists? It says, why is the United States avoiding calling Morocco as a terrorist state, despite several recent reports on the Sahel or ISIS and the relationship with the Moroccan government? And one last question that I have, if nobody else have any question in this regard, we are here as a civil society. Our role is to, one, raise awareness, get involved, and make sure we make a difference. What are your thoughts, and what are your recommendations and suggestions for the Sahrawi civil society around the world? One, to influence the U.S. Decision makers, Congress. What are your thoughts in that regard as well? And if you don't have any questions, please make sure that you fill out the survey. I will be pasted again as an important. And let me make sure I mute this. Yes, and that's all I have for now.
Okay, so the Green March. Earlier in the conversation, we discussed the United States' role. That there are documents. There are documents that I've obtained from the U.S. government, and there are other documents that have come out. As I said, the United States knew 2 weeks before it was announced that Morocco was going to invade Western Sahara. The CIA had this information from sources within, I assume, the Moroccan military, and they informed Henry Kissinger about it. Kissinger officially told Morocco that they didn't want to see a conflict with Spain. There was an assumption that Spain would actually fight to keep Western Sahara, but Morocco was quite lucky that Franco fell into a coma the day after the Green March was announced. And so Kissinger made sure that the United Nations didn't do anything to stop Morocco from getting Western Sahara. and the what we call the civil war inside the Spanish government in late October 1975. That also helped with Morocco because the divided nature of the Spanish government allowed the conservative pro-Moroccan factions to cut a deal with Hassan. Kissinger, we know, lied to the U.S. president about what was at stake in Western Sahara and about what was going on, so that the president made decisions that fit what Kissinger wanted. But for the most part, U.S. actions in 1975 were most powerful at the level of the United Nations by making sure that the United Nations did not do what it is supposed to do, right? The United Nations was created to stop aggression. The United Nations was created to stop states from taking territory from other states, from going to war unilaterally with other states without a good reason. And in this case, the United States allowed or made sure the United Nations failed in its most primary function. Now, in terms of terrorism, we know that governments around the world use terrorists for their foreign policy to advance certain agendas. We know, all the Arab states probably have had their, fingers in, manipulating, using, creating terrorism, right? But with Morocco, I think the really interesting thing is the extent to which Morocco has sent countless numbers of jihadis to go fight around the world, in Syria and elsewhere. And yet that becomes a reason for why the U.S. should support Morocco, because if Morocco is able to generate so many terrorists, then it raises lots of concerns about the stability of Morocco, and those concerns are manipulated by Morocco to continue the high levels of security support that it gets from countries like the United States and France.
Okay, and this is one last question from Salka. Can the Sahrawi leadership be bold and guarantees the U.S. to take control of the Sahel region in exchange of the American support to impose a fair solution? And the last question that I asked earlier is in regards to the civil society involvement. What can they do to make a difference?
Yeah. So the United States, one of the problems I think the United States has in terms of security in the Sahel region is it has to work with the governments, right? But the people who are actually, I think, the real stakeholders in security in the Sahel are not the central governments, right? It's not the government of Mali. It's not the government in Nouakchott. It's not the Moroccan government, right? The real stakeholders are the Sahrawis, the Tuaregs, the people who live in the Sahara. And the problem with U.S. policy is it has actually alienated the people who should be the stakeholders in Sahel security. So I agree that the United States should work with Polisario on issues of Sahel security, but obviously they can't work with a non-state actor, particularly one that is opposed to the interests of a strong ally like Morocco. And here I think, the point needs to be made that Morocco has, again, exploited this terrorism issue in the Sahel and probably has been involved in manipulating it, as many governments are, in order to reinforce its claim on Western Sahara. Western Sahara, they will say, is the most stable corner of the Sahara, and that's because of the tens of thousands of Moroccan troops there. So Morocco's manipulation of the Sahel terrorism issue is a very important dimension to all of this. And you see it also as obviously an argument that works when it comes to France, because you can see France is heavily involved in the Sahel region with Operation Saval. In terms of civil society, I just think, I'm often approached, by journalists, consultants, researchers, who feel that, they have a difficult time, talking to people from Western Sahara, reaching out to people from Western Sahara, right? So the really important thing, I think, for a lot of Sahrawi civil society is to have a presence, to be online, to be reachable, so that their opinions can actually get out into the world, because obviously there are strong efforts to silence Sahrawis by Morocco. The refugee camps in Tindouf are very difficult to reach. Not a lot of people can get there. But it's very important, I think, that the Sahrawi civil society leverages all these new technologies and social media and means of communication to really build up the presence online.
Thank you, Professor Jacob Mundy. I would like to remind everyone, just if you would like to learn more about Western Sahara, I strongly suggest that you read the book that Professor Jacob Mundy co-authored with Stephen Zunes. It's Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. This is one I've read this book a while back, but this book is definitely one of the books that I would recommend if you want to look at an overview and of the conflict, what is happening in the issues mostly. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, or we can share also Professor Jacob Mundy, with his permission, his email with everyone. Again, I would like to remind everyone that there is a survey. If you can fill out that would be great. And again, I can't thank you enough, Professor. Thank you for your time. Thank you you've always been there. We've seen you in various occasions here and there, and you've always responded to our request. We know your time is valuable, and we'd like to thank you very much for your time. And thank you, everyone who joined this webinar. There will be more to come of those webinars. If you'd like to stay in touch, if you'd like to be invited, please leave us your feedback and your contact information, and we'll make sure we send you our next event. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.